The rent was 11 days late, and for that, 3 men in pressed shirts came to put a 71-year-old widow's furniture out on the sidewalk in the rain. They didn't knock soft. They banged on that door like they owned the sound of it. And when Margaret Coyle opened up in her housecoat with her late husband's reading glasses still pushed up on her forehead, the youngest of them read her a paper out loud so the whole street could hear. And he started it the way those papers start, with the tenant's whole legal name, Margaret Coyle, said flat and public like a thing being catalogued, and then went on about default, about possession, about how she had until the count of nothing to get her things and get gone. Then the tallest one turned and shouted down the walk at the other 2, "Evict her, now. Get it all out on the sidewalk," loud enough that the windows across the street heard every word of it. And he reached past her and took the small ceramic urn off the little table by the door, the one that held what was left of a man named Walter Coyle, and he set it out on the wet step like it was a milk bottle. Margaret didn't scream. She just made a sound, low, the kind of sound a body makes when something inside it tears quiet. And 40 feet down the block, an old man with gray in his beard and grease under his nails, a man in a faded work vest who fixed engines for a living and had fixed a great many other things in his time, heard that name come down the wet street and went absolutely still. Every soul on Delacroix Street who heard it heard a dead husband's name. He heard something else. Coyle was not the name she took when she married Walter. Coyle was her maiden name, the name she was born with, the name of a family this old man had made a promise to on a doorstep 300 miles from here, a long time before Walter ever existed. He set down the wrench she was holding and started walking. What those 3 men in pressed shirts did not know was who they had just walked past to get to that door. A long time ago, in rooms full of hard people, men who had done things they'd never say out loud used to go quiet when somebody said the name Cody Rourke. Nobody on that street that morning had the first idea what was about to happen, least of all the landlord's man who had set an old woman's husband out on a wet step. And I'll tell you now, before we go one step further, that 11 days of rent came to $240, and that number is going to matter more than you can possibly understand yet. This is the kind of story this channel exists to tell, so stay with me, because the walking part is the least of it. It started barely 20 minutes earlier than that. Margaret Coyle had been up since before dawn, the way she'd been up since before dawn for 36 years, because Walter had risen at 5 to open the hardware store on Delacroix Street, and even 3 years after they put him in the ground, she couldn't teach her body to sleep past the hour his had lived by. She made coffee she mostly didn't drink. She sat at the kitchen table with the light off and watched the gray come up over the rooftops. On the wall above the table, there was a photograph nobody who came to the house understood anymore. A young woman with dark hair laughing on the back of a motorcycle, one arm thrown up. And if you'd asked Margaret who that girl was, she'd have smiled and said, "Oh, nobody. Just somebody I used to be." She had gotten the letter about the building changing hands in the spring. New owner, a company with a name that sounded like a law firm and acted like a crowbar. The old landlord, Mr. Pellegrino, had let her carry rent to the 15th for years because Walter had rewired his whole building for the cost of the parts. And a man remembers that. The new people did not remember anything, because remembering costs money, and forgetting is free. They raised the rent $400 in July. They stopped answering the phone in August. And when Margaret's Social Security landed late in October, because the government is the one institution that has never once been on time for anybody, they moved on her like she was a stain they'd been waiting to scrub. $240. That was the whole of it. She had the money. She'd have had it Thursday. But Thursday was not soon enough for men who'd already decided that an old woman alone was the easiest kind of nothing to push. Now, that's the part everybody wants to skip past, straight to the old man and the walking. So let's slow down for a minute, because you need to understand exactly who was living 40 feet down that block before you watch what he does to the shape of this morning. His name, the one in the shop, was C. Rourke, and the sign had said Rourke Small Engine for 19 years. He opened at 7, not 7:15, not 5 of, 7, every morning, the way some men go to church, and the neighborhood had come to set its clock by the rattle of that steel door going up. He was 68 years old. His hands were the kind of hands that had done everything a hand can do, and had lately done nothing but honest work. And that was a thing he'd chosen on purpose, the way another man chooses to quit drinking. Big, he was, in a way that had nothing at all to do with size, because he wasn't a tall man, and the years had taken the top off whatever he'd been. Quiet, mostly. But when Cody Rourke spoke, people leaned in toward him without meaning to, the way you lean toward a stove in winter. 8 months back, a kid had shown up sleeping in the alley behind the shop, 19 or 20, sharp-eyed and jumpy, the kind of sharp a person only gets by learning early that trusting the wrong face gets you hurt. Name was Danny. Rourke didn't ask him where he'd run from. He handed him a broom the first morning, and a paycheck the first Friday, and a key the second week. And in 8 months, he never once raised his voice at the boy, which for Danny was a stranger thing than being handed money. Rourke poured him coffee every morning without being asked, black, 2 sugars, in a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest grandpa," a joke somebody had left there a long time ago that Rourke had never explained. The neighborhood had been dying slow, the way they do. Pellegrino sold out and moved away when the new company bought the block, and the Coyle hardware store had been dark since the year they buried Walter. The diner cut back to weekends. And into that slow dying, in the spring, came a man named Vince Toma, and the thing he'd built, which was simpler and uglier than anything Walter Coyle ever wired. Vince Toma was 29 years old. He had a tattoo of a crown on the side of his neck that he'd gotten at 22, to remind himself of something, and a smile that never once made it as far as his eyes. He ran the property company like it was a fist, and around it he'd built a little crew, young men mostly, who went door to door on his behalf and made sure the rent came in early and the fear came in on time. He built the whole thing on fear instead of respect, because fear is faster, and Vince had never in his life had the patience for anything slow. I'll tell you where his fear came from, because it matters. Not to excuse him. Nothing excuses a man setting a widow's husband out in the rain, but so you understand him. Vince Toma grew up watching his own father swallow it. His old man ran a little shop 2 towns over, and every month a certain kind of man came in and took a cut and smiled while he did it. And Vince's father smiled back and paid it and said nothing, year after year, and folded a little smaller every time. Vince swore at some young, hard age that he would be the one who took, never the one who paid, that he would be the crown and not the neck. And so he was. He'd just never once met the kind of man his father had been too smart to fight. The first visit to Margaret came in September. 2 of Vince's young men, polite as knives, sat in her kitchen under the photograph of the laughing, dark-haired girl, and explained that the building was being repositioned, that word, repositioned, and that residents who couldn't meet the new market rate would be helped to relocate. They put a paper in front of her. Sign here, and you leave by the 1st, and we'll waive the back balance as a courtesy. Margaret read it twice. Then she folded her hands on the table, the way she'd folded them in 1,000 churches, and she said one word. No. The kitchen went still. One of the young men actually laughed, a short, surprised bark, because most people telling Vince Thoma's men no said it with their voice shaking, and Margaret Coyle's did not shake at all. She said, "My husband and I paid to live in this building for 36 years, and I will pay the rent I owe on Thursday, and you will not have my home." And she stood up, which meant they were done. That night, Danny asked Rourke about it, because word travels a dying block fast, and Rourke listened and said only, "They'll come back." Danny said, "So what do we do?" And Rourke looked at the boy a long moment and said, "We mind our own, unless our own becomes somebody else's business." Danny didn't understand that. He would. What Rourke didn't say, what he didn't tell Danny or anybody, was that he had known exactly who Margaret Coyle was for 8 years. Not since he opened the shop, which was longer than that by half. He had been on that block 11 years before it ever landed on him. It landed on a Tuesday, when he read the name Coyle on the front of the hardware store, the way a man finally reads a sign he has walked past 1,000 times. And then, that same afternoon, saw the woman herself come out onto her step, and something in the way she stood reached back 30-odd years and grabbed him by the throat. Because Cody Rourke had not always fixed engines on Delacroix Street. Once, a long time ago, in a life he had folded up and put away, he had ridden. Not the way weekend men ride now. He'd worn a patch that meant something in rooms where meaning got you killed. He'd worn it from 19 years old until he was near 40, the better part of 20 years. And by the time he was 28, he had been what those clubs call a chaplain, which is not a soft word, not a Sunday word, and not a thing anybody hands to a young man unless they have already watched him do something they cannot forget. A chaplain in that world is the man who buries the brothers, the man who sits with the mothers, the man who holds the thing together when the thing wants to fly apart into blood, and who is trusted to do it precisely because everyone in the room knows exactly what he is capable of, and exactly how completely he has chosen not to. The kind of standing you earn and bleed for, and that some men never live long enough to actually wear. And there had been a brother in those years, a young one, wild and good, named Sean Coyle. Sean Coyle rode 2 years and died at 24 on a wet highway that wasn't his fault, run off the road by a truck that never stopped, and Cody Rourke had been the one to go tell the family, because that was the job. That was the whole terrible weight of the patch he wore. He'd driven 300 miles to a small house and knocked soft on the door, and taken his colors off before he did it, out of respect. And a mother had opened the door, and behind her, 31 years old, and holding on to the door frame like it was the only thing keeping her standing, was a dark-haired woman with her brother's exact eyes, the big sister who had half raised him. And Cody Rourke had made a promise on that doorstep, quiet, the way he did everything, one word at a time so it would hold. He told that family, "Whatever comes, wherever I am, as long as I am breathing, your family is my family, and if you ever need me, you will not have to ask twice." The dark-haired woman was named Margaret, and a few years after that she met a good, square man named Walter Coyle. No relation, just the same name, a coincidence the two of them always laughed about. And she married him and became Margaret Coyle a second time, which is the only reason a name that should have shouted at somebody sat quiet on a mailbox on Delacroix Street for 36 years. Because every soul who read it assumed it had come to her from Walter, and not one of them ever guessed she had been born with it. And she folded up the girl on the motorcycle and put her away. And she never once, in all the years after, went looking to collect on a dead man's brother's promise. She didn't even know the man who'd made it was 40 feet down her own block. He'd known. He'd known for 8 years, and he'd kept his distance, And he'd poured coffee and fixed engines and watched over her the way you watch a candle you're not allowed to touch. Because keeping a promise doesn't always look like standing close. Sometimes it looks like a man who opens at 7 every morning so that if the day ever comes, he is already there. Now you understand the photograph. Now you understand the walking. So let's go back to the wet step and the urn and the 3 men in pressed shirts, because we left an old woman making a sound like something tearing, and a man setting down a wrench. Rourke came up the sidewalk the way he did everything, slow, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world and none of the fear the rest of us carry. The 3 of them didn't even clock him at first. An old mechanic in a greasy vest, nobody, nothing. The tall one who'd moved the urn was reading Margaret her paper again, louder, for the pleasure of it. Rourke stepped past him, bent down, and picked Walter Coyle up off the wet step with both hands. Careful, the way you'd lift a sleeping child. And he set the urn back on the little table inside the door. Then he turned around. He gave them a chance first. He always did. He stood there a half-second longer than he needed to, and he said one thing, quiet. "Go home, boys. Nobody has to remember today." The tall one laughed, told the old man to walk his grease back down the street before he got hurt. The other 2 spread out a little, the way young men do when they've decided a thing is going to happen, and they want room for it. And Danny, who'd come running up the block behind Rourke, calling the old man's name out loud the whole way, "Cody! Cody!" stopped dead on the sidewalk. Because Danny had never seen the old man's face go like that. Still, gone somewhere, far off and cold. The tall one put his hand flat on Rourke's chest to shove him. He never finished the shove. What happens next happened in about 4 seconds, and I'm going to tell it to you the way 6 different neighbors told it after, which is to say, none of them agreed on all of it, because it was that fast. Rourke took the wrist of the hand on his chest, turned it a quarter turn, and the tall man went down onto the wet concrete on his knees with a sound like a chair scraping. And he stayed down, because something in his shoulder had been asked a question it had no answer for. 1 down. Rourke didn't even look at him. He looked at the other 2. 9 seconds, maybe 10, was all the rest of it took. The second man swung, and Rourke wasn't where the swing went. And then that man was sitting on the sidewalk holding his own face and blinking like he'd walked into a door in the dark. The third man, the youngest, the one who'd read the paper, just stopped, put his hands up, palms out, backed away. And Rourke let him. Then the old man did the thing that told Danny everything about who he really was. He didn't stand over the men he'd put down and say a word. He turned his back on them entirely, which is the most dangerous and the most contemptuous thing a fighting man can do. And he went to Margaret, who was standing in her doorway with both hands over her mouth, and he said, soft, "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. He said, "Is anything of yours out here that shouldn't be?" And she pointed, shaking, at a box of Walter's shirts the men had set on the walk. And Rourke picked it up and carried it back inside her door. And then he came back out, and, with the whole street watching, he swept the broken pieces of a flower pot one of the men had knocked over into a neat pile against the wall with the side of his boot, unhurried, like a man closing up his shop. He tended to the widow before he ever spoke to the men he'd beaten. That's who he was. To the tall one, still down on the concrete, he said only, "Tell whoever sent you that the rent is $240, and it will be paid Thursday, and that this address is closed. Tell him a friend of the family said so." And the tall one, cradling his arms, spat and said, "You don't know who you just bought trouble with, old man." And Rourke, already walking away, said over his shoulder, "No, he doesn't know who he just sold it to." The three of them limped and drove off, and the street breathed out. And somebody laughed, the nervous kind of laugh that escapes a body once it finally believes it's safe. Margaret made Rourke come in and sit, and she made him coffee he mostly didn't drink. And she looked at him a long while across her kitchen table, onto the photograph, and she said, "Do I know you?" And Rourke looked up at the girl on the motorcycle, and then back at Margaret and said, "No, ma'am. I just fix engines down the block." Thursday came. Margaret walked her $240 to the property office herself and put it on the counter and got a receipt. And for 2 days the block was quiet, and Rourke believed mostly that the matter was finished. He was wrong. The worst of it hadn't so much as introduced itself yet. Here's what had happened in the hour since the three men limped out of Delacroix Street. They'd gone straight back to Vince Toma, and they'd told it the way beaten men tell things, which is to say, they made the old man 10 feet tall to cover their own shame. And Vince Toma did what Vince Toma did with everything. He decided it was about him. Some grease monkey senior citizen had put 3 of his people on the ground and told him by messenger that an address was closed. To Vince, who had built the entire crown on his neck out of never once being the neck, that wasn't 3 men with sore shoulders. That was the whole thing coming apart. If the block heard that an old man had said no to Vince Toma and it stuck, then everybody would start saying no. And the fear he'd spent years building would drain out of the neighborhood like water out of a cracked jug. So it stopped being about rent. It stopped being about the widow. It became about making sure that every soul on Delacroix Street watched what happens to a man who says an address is closed. And there was a man in Vince's crew, older, near 60, a bookkeeper type named Sal, who'd been around the block a lot longer than Vince, and had been kept on precisely because he knew things. And Sal had been standing in the corner when the tall one, still white with pain, described the old mechanic. Grease vest, gray beard, didn't rush, turned his back on us. Told us to tell you a friend of the family said the address was closed. And then the tall one said, and there was a name on the shop, Rourke. And the phone in Sal's hand went down slow onto the desk. Sal, who had gone the color of old papers, said one word. Rourke. He said it again, quieter. What did the shop say? And the tall one said, Rourke small engine, why? And Sal sat down, slow, the way a much heavier man sits, and he took off his glasses and turned them over in his hands, and didn't put them back on. Vince said, Sal, what? And Sal said, first name. Did anybody hear a first name? And Danny, though none of them knew it, had said it out on the street. Cody. Somebody in Vince's crew had a cousin on Delacroix Street. The name Cody Rourke came into that office about 20 minutes later, over the phone, in a text, 3 words, and Sal read it, and set the phone down slower than he'd set anything down all day. Vince, getting angry now at being outside of something in his own room, said, Who is he? Say it. And Sal looked at the young men in that office, none of them older than 30, and he said, None of you would know the name because you were in grade school. But there was a time, and it wasn't as long ago as you'd like it to be, when men who ate men like us for breakfast used to lower their voices when Cody Rourke came into a room. He wasn't muscle. Muscle you can hire. He was the other thing. He was the man they sent to a family when a brother died. He was the man who held the whole thing together. And the only reason a man gets trusted to hold a thing like that together is that everybody in the room has personally seen what he does when it comes apart. Sal said, I saw him one time, 20-odd years ago, walk into a room where 6 men had decided to do something, and he didn't say but a few words, and all 6 of them decided different, and nobody laid a hand on anybody. And I have never in my life been so scared of a man who was so calm. Sal turned his glasses over again and said, "And the worst thing, Vince, the worst thing, is that you can't be sure he's alone. Men like that, they had brothers, and some of those brothers are still breathing. And if you go at him and he's not alone, you won't be dealing with 3 sore shoulders. You'll be dealing with the kind of thing that doesn't leave anybody to tell it after." And that uncertainty, Sal not being able to promise the old man had nobody left, that was worse than a yes would have been. But Vince Toma was 29 years old, and he had a crown on his neck and a father in his memory who'd smiled and paid, and he heard all of it, every word Sal said. And the only thing it did was make the fear in his own chest turn into the thing he always turned fear into. He stood up and he said, "So he used to be somebody. Used to be. Look at him now. He's an old man who fixes lawnmowers. And he put 3 kids on the ground, so we don't send kids." He looked around the room and said, "Get everybody, everybody, and bring what you bring when you're only going to knock on a door one time." So it stopped being a shakedown. It became a cleanup. And just like that, the whole shape of the day changed. There's a thing I need you to sit with here, because it's the thing this whole story turns on, and the internet-brained part of your mind is going to want to rush past it to the fight, so I'm going to hold you here on purpose for a second. A frightened man with a crown he can't afford to lose is the most dangerous kind of stupid there is, because he will spend other people's lives to protect his own reflection. Vince Toma didn't hate Margaret Coyle. He'd forgotten she existed. And he didn't really hate Rourke either. What he couldn't live with was the block watching him blink. That's the engine of nearly every terrible thing men do to each other. And it was about to bring 11 cars down a dying street. Remember the number 240. Hold on to it. Because that is what all of this still, technically, cost. Sal made one phone call that Vince didn't hear about, later, from a hallway, to a number he'd kept for 30 years and hoped he'd never use. He didn't reach anybody. He left a message. He said, "This is Sal Bruno. I don't know if this line still works. I don't know if you're still above ground. But if any of you are, a young fool is about to go at Cody Rourke on Delacroix Street tonight, and I wanted it on the record that I told him not to." Then he hung up, and he went and got his coat, because Sal had decided something about which side of his own life he wanted to be standing on when it was over. Hold on to that message. Sal thought he was talking into a dead line, into a machine sitting in an empty room in another state, and he walked out of that hallway believing he had accomplished exactly nothing except the clearing of his own conscience, which is what a man always believes when he does not understand the size of the thing he has just put his hand on. The line was not dead. Back on the block, it was Danny who saw it first. He'd stepped out to lock the shop at closing, and he saw a car go by slow, then another, then a third. All of them slow, all of them full, windows up, nobody's arm hanging out, nobody laughing, and Danny had grown up hard enough to know exactly what a slow, full car with the windows up means. And he went back inside, white, and said, "Cody, there's cars." Rourke was at the bench with a carburetor apart in front of him, and he didn't look up right away. He said, "How many?" Danny said, "3. No, more. They keep coming." And Rourke set down the little brush he was holding, careful in its place, and he wiped his hands on the rag and hung the rag on its nail, and he said, "All right." And that was all. All right. He told Danny to go, not asked, told. He said, "There's a door at the back of the storeroom. It lets onto Petrie Street. You go out it now and you keep walking, and you don't come back tonight." Danny said, "No." Rourke looked at him, and it wasn't anger in his face. It was something worse. It was tenderness. And he said, "Son, I am asking you this for me, not for you." He said, "There are things a young man can unsee, and things he can't. And I have spent 40 years wishing I could give a couple of them back. And I am not going to stand here and let you watch me be a man I quit being on purpose. Go." And Danny went. He got as far as the mouth of Petrie Street with a clean path to the bus and the rest of his life. And he stopped. He stood in the dark with his heart going, and he thought about a broom handed to him without a question, and coffee poured black with 2 sugars every single morning, and a key put in his hand in the second week by a man who had every reason not to trust a jumpy kid from an alley. And Danny discovered a thing about himself that he hadn't known, which is that he was not going to be able to walk away from the only person who'd ever handed him something without making him pay for it first. So he didn't get on the bus. He circled back through the dark, quiet, and he found a spot across the street behind the plate glass of the shuttered diner, in the black, where he could see the whole front of Rourke's small engine through the window. And he put his back to the cold glass, and he waited, with his hand already halfway to his mouth. Inside, Rourke moved through his shop the way a man moves through a house he loves for what he thinks might be the last time. He turned the sign. He locked the front, not because a lock would matter, but because it would make them come the way he wanted them to come. And then he went to the back, to a shelf above the workbench, and he took down a steel box, a plain gray strong box, dusty on the top the way a thing gets dusty when it has sat in exactly one place for 19 years. And he set it on the bench, and he opened it with a small key he kept on the same ring as everything else. And he looked at what was inside for a long moment without taking it out. There was a folded piece of leather in that box, a vest, colors, a patch. The thing he'd taken off on a doorstep 300 miles away to tell a mother her boy was gone. He'd checked that box was locked and that key was where it should be every single morning for 19 years, the way another man checks the burner is off. And in 19 years, he had never once had a reason to open it. He didn't put it on now either. He just looked at it. And then he closed the lid, most of the way, and left it there on the bench, unlocked. Then he counted his exits and his angles and the number of steps from the front door to the workbench, the way you count a thing you have counted 1,000 times in another life, calm, professional. And out on the road, the sound of the cars stopping built and built, engines going quiet one after another, doors opening. And then a great many boots on the pavement, the sound of a great many men arriving, with no intention of leaving anybody behind who could talk about it later. 68 years old, alone, about to be outnumbered by a margin that would have made most men twice his size lie down and pray, and still, by a wide distance, the most dangerous thing within 500 feet of that shop. They came in careful. That was the first thing Rourke noticed, and it told him everything, because the 3 in the morning had come in stupid and loud, and these men came through his door slow, spread wide, hands ready, checking corners. And a man doesn't come into an old mechanic's shop like that unless somebody has told him what the old mechanic used to be. So, they knew. Good. Knowing made them slow, and slow was the only thing he had. 11 of them came in, and Vince Toma came in last, the way he came to everything last, after it was safe. And Vince did what Vince always did which was talk. He walked in with his crown on his neck and his hands loose, and he started telling the old man a story about respect, and about the block, and about how nothing personal, this is just business, you understand. You were somebody once. And Rourke didn't answer a single word of it. Because Rourke wasn't listening to the words. He was watching the spread. He'd already found the one man in the room who was the real threat, a lean, quiet one near the wall, who hadn't spread out with the others, who kept his weight even and his hands still. The only one in there besides Rourke himself who knew what he was doing. And while Vince talked about respect, Rourke answered the room the only way that room could be answered. He didn't answer the words. He answered the spread. He moved first, and he moved at the quiet one by the wall, because you take the real thing off the board before it knows the game has started. The first fight in the morning had been fast. This one was not. And here is where you expect me to give you the whole of it, blow by blow, the way these stories always go. I am not going to. The fight on that shop floor was never the part that mattered. And before this night is finished, you are going to understand exactly why I am telling you that now, instead of at the end. So take it short, the way the men who were in it took it. The quiet one by the wall went first, and went hard, and did not get up quick. Rourke put his back to the steel workbench so they could only come at him from the front, and he used the narrow lane between the bench and the shelving so that 11 men could only ever be 2 or 3 men at a time in the place where it counted. He used a stool. He used the door frame. He did not throw one wasted motion, because he did not have one to spare. His knees told him he was not the man he'd been at 30. His shoulder, the bad one, told him loud. But 4 decades had not taken the one thing that had always mattered most about Cody Rourke, the thing that had made men lower their voices, which was simply this: in a fight, he did not stop. Other men stop. They reach a place where the pain, or the odds, or the sense of the thing says, lie down. And they lie down. And that is the most human thing in the world. Rourke had had that part burned out of him a long time ago, in a life he'd walked away from, precisely because a man who cannot stop is a terrible thing to be. So when the big one got a length of pipe off the shelf and swung it, and Rourke turned most of the way out of it, but not all, and it caught him along the side of the head above the ear, and the whole shop tilted sideways, and the floor came up an inch, and the noise of it all went far away and small, and every man left standing in that room believed he was about to watch the old man go down for good. The old man did not go down. He got a hand on the edge of the bench and pulled the world back level by nothing but will. And he came off that wall into the big one with the pipe and took it away from him. And the big one folded. And the shop went quiet in a new way, a way that had fear in it, because 11 men had walked in sure, and there were far fewer than 11 standing now. And the old man was still on his feet, with blood running down into his beard, breathing hard, back to the bench, not stopping. Across the street, behind the cold glass of the diner, Danny had both hands over his mouth and was not breathing right. And that was the moment Vince Toma, 29 years old, watching the thing he could not afford come apart in front of the whole crew he needed to fear him, reached into his jacket and took out a gun. A gun changes a fight. Doesn't matter how skilled a man is, how tough, how willing, how much will he's got left. Steel doesn't care about any of it. The whole shop went still. Total silence, the kind you could drown in. And into that silence came the only sound in the room, which was the small tick of the metal shop clock on the wall, and a faint hiss from a compressor cooling down in the corner, and Cody Rourke's own breath. Every man in there stopped, the ones standing and the ones on the floor, because they all understood that the thing had just crossed a line their young leader had never crossed before. And Vince's hand, holding the gun, was shaking. It was shaking because Vince Toma, for all the crown on his neck and all the men he'd frightened, had never once actually crossed this particular line, had never pointed a loaded thing at a man and meant it. And some animal part of him knew that on the far side of that line, there was no coming back to being the boy who'd only ever wanted his father to stand up. Rourke straightened up off the bench, slow. He wiped the blood out of his eye with the back of one wrist, unhurried, and he looked at the shaking gun. And then he looked at the boy holding it. And when he spoke, it was in the exact same quiet he'd used on the street that morning, the quiet that made people lean in. He said, "Son, if you miss, and at this range with your hand doing that, you will, then I'm going to take that from you. And after that, this stops being something you walk away from." He said, "I have buried more men than you have ever met, and I have never once wanted to bury a young one. So I'm going to tell you what happens next, and you are going to listen. Nobody in this room has to die tonight, not even you. Put it down." And that was the moment the shop door opened again. Danny came through it. He'd had a clean path, a clean bus, the whole rest of his life laid out down Petrie Street in the dark, and he'd turned around and come back through it instead. And now he stepped into that shop full of hard men and a shaking gun. And in both his hands, held up high over his head where every man in the room could see it, was the folded leather from the steel box on the bench. The colors, the patch, the vest of a chaplain from a world these young men had only ever heard about in warnings. Danny didn't know all of what it meant, but he'd heard Sal's name whispered on the block that afternoon, and he'd heard an old man on a phone say the words, "friend of the family," and he'd looked in that box while Rourke's back was turned, and he was a sharp kid who'd learned early how fear moves through a room, and he held the thing up high, and he said the only thing he could think to say, and it was a bluff, and it wasn't a bluff. He said, loud into the silence, "You think he's alone? He made the call an hour ago. He said the whole crest is coming, and they know this address, and they know all your faces now, and every single one of you standing in this room tonight is already a name on a list you do not want to be on." He said, "You can shoot an old man who fixes lawnmowers, but you cannot shoot what comes for him after. Ask the old one. Ask Sal." And in the doorway behind Danny, on foot, unarmed, deliberately not with the crew, having walked the last block on his own 2 feet in the dark, stood Sal Bruno, 60 years old, the color of old paper, and Sal looked at the young men he'd spent 3 years standing next to, and he said, quiet, "It's true. I made the call. I've seen what he is, and I've heard what stands behind him. And I am telling all of you, as the only man in this room old enough to know, that if that leather is real, and it is, then there is no number of us that is enough. You can end tonight one of 2 ways. Down a road you can still turn back from, or down the one where none of us come home. And it doesn't even fix anything, because he'll still have said no. And now he'll have said it from the ground, and men will come to collect the difference." And here is where you expect the young men to run the arithmetic, to stand in that shop and weigh what they'd been promised for the night against what it might cost them, one at a time, and quietly work out that a dead man's stories were not worth their own skin. They never got that far, because that was the moment a kid over by the window, 22 years old, with his hand still on a tire iron, turned his head toward the street and said out loud to nobody in particular, "What is that?" It was one engine. A long way off, out past the overpass, the low, uneven note of a big twin holding a steady speed. Just the one. And in a neighborhood that had been dying quietly for 6 years, one motorcycle at 9 o'clock at night is nothing at all. Then it was not one. I want to tell you what that sounded like, and I am not certain I can, so I will give it to you the way the people on Delacroix Street gave it to each other afterward, because they all said the same thing in different words. They said, "You felt it in the floor before you heard it in the air." Mrs. Ferreira at number 12, 79 years old, who had gone to bed at 8 the way she always did, said she sat straight up, thinking a train had come off the line. The diner owner, standing in the dark of his own shuttered dining room 10 feet from where Danny had been crouched an hour before, said it came up Delacroix like weather. They came in from the north end, and they came in slow. That is the part nobody who retells this story ever gets right, so let me be exact about it. They did not come screaming. Nobody stood a bike up. Nobody laid on a throttle, not once, not one man. They came up that street at the posted speed with their headlights on, 2 abreast where the road allowed it, and single file where it did not. And they took the corner off Petrie the way a funeral takes a corner. And then they parked. Front wheels to the curb, evenly spaced, between the lines the city had painted on Delacroix Street in 1988, and nobody had honored since. Down both sides of the block and around onto Petrie, and past the shuttered diner, and past the dark windows of the Coyle hardware store. And when there was no more street left to fill, they parked around the far side of the intersection and walked back. Mrs. Ferreira counted them from her front window, out loud, because she did not know what else to do with her hands. She got to 60, lost her place, and started over. The responding officer's report, filed at 2:40 the following morning, put the number at 81 motorcycles parked on Delacroix and Petrie, and noted, in the flat language those reports get written in, that every one of them was parked legally. 81. Over a $240 rent bill. Here's how a thing like that happens, because it is not magic and it is not luck. And I want you to understand that what came down that street was not the result of a phone call. It was the result of 30 years of a man being worth calling about. Sal Bruno left one message on a number he was certain was dead. A man in another state listens to it twice, and that man did not call 80 people. He called 4, and those 4 each called 4, and it went out the way it has always gone out in that world. No internet, nothing written down anywhere. One voice to one voice. And what went out was not a request, and it was not an order. It was 6 words. Rourke's in trouble. Delacroix Street. Tonight. And then they rode. Some of them for 20 minutes. Some of them for 5 hours. A good number of them had never once in their lives laid eyes on Cody Rourke, had only ever heard the name, the way you hear the name of a thing that happened before you got there. And they came anyway. Because the whole arrangement, the entire point of the arrangement, the thing that patch actually means, underneath all the noise people make about it, is that you do not have to know a man to come when the call goes out with his name on it. And then the engines died. Not raggedly, not one and then another and then a few more, the way a parking lot empties. All of them, inside about 4 seconds, like somebody had asked. And what came down over Delacroix Street after that was a silence that every person who stood in it has been trying to describe to somebody ever since. Danny said, years later, that with the front door of that shop standing wide open onto a street with 100 men on it, he could hear the little metal clock ticking on the wall behind him. And nobody came in. That is the part nobody ever believes when they hear it, and it is the whole thing. 81 machines and better than 100 men, because a few had come 2 up, and a few more had come in trucks, and not one of them came through that door. Not one of them shouted. Not one of them picked up anything he could swing. They stood along both sides of that street in the dark, in their colors, with their arms down at their sides, and they looked at the open door of Rourke's small engine, and they waited, and they did not make a sound. They had not come to fight anybody. They had come to be seen. Because Vince Thoma's entire life ran on one machine, and the machine was this. He was the most frightening thing in any room he walked into, and everybody in the room knew it. And that was the whole of the crown. And there is no punch on this earth that breaks a machine like that. You can beat a man like Vince half to death, and he will be up in 6 weeks with a better story about himself than the one he had before. What breaks it is standing him in a doorway in front of every soul he has ever frightened and letting him look at 100 men who did not come for him, who did not even come to hurt him, who had ridden all night for somebody else entirely and did not consider him worth the trouble of a single word. Inside the shop, a man near the door set down what he was holding. Then all of them did. They went out through it in 1s and 2s, with their hands open and empty, where everybody could see them. And the men in the street parted and made a lane for them the way you make a lane. And nobody laid a hand on one of them, and nobody said one word to them. And every last one of those young men had to walk the length of Delacroix Street being looked at. That was all that happened to them. They were looked at. 2 of them were crying by the time they reached the corner, and could not have told you why. And Vince Thoma stood alone in the middle of the shop, with a gun in a shaking hand. No crew left to see him be the crown, and a street outside his own open door that had stopped being his street about 90 seconds earlier. And that was the whole game. Because without the room, the fear had nothing to stand on. His smile, the one that never reached his eyes, flickered like a candle catching a draft it hadn't seen coming. Rourke took 1 step toward him, slow, both hands open at his sides, and he said 1 word at a time so it would hold. Put it down. And the gun came down first, slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument Vince's arm had been losing all night. And Rourke reached out and took it out of the boy's hand, gentle, with 2 hands, the way you take something from a child who's tired. And Vince Thoma let him. It was over. Truly over this time. No last blow, no blood but the old man's own. The crown was still on Vince's neck, and it meant nothing now. And he knew it. And he stood there, and his shoulders came down, and for just a second, before the police lights, he looked less like a man who'd built an empire out of fear, and more like a boy who'd wanted his whole life for somebody to stand up so he wouldn't have to become the thing that stood up. And then Vince Thoma had to walk out. That was the sentence. Not the gun, not the case, not the 3 days of talking that came later. he had to walk out. He came through that door last, the way he came to everything last, with nothing in his hands at all. And he stopped dead on the step, because half the block was out on their porches by then, in bathrobes and in coats thrown on over nightclothes. And the tenants of his own building were standing on the steps he had been squeezing them off of all summer. And 100 men he had never met in his life were standing in the road. And every single one of them was looking at him. Nobody yelled. That was the thing that finished him. Nobody threw anything. Nobody called him a name. And if they had, he could have used it. He could have carried it out of there and built it into a story where he was still the one they were afraid of. They just looked. And then an old man came out of the crowd, older than Rourke by a good 10 years, thin, white-bearded, walking with a stick he plainly did not need. And the men in that street made room for him without being asked, which told you everything about what he was. He came up the walk and stopped 4 feet from Vince Toma, and looked at him, and did not say one word. He looked at him until Vince looked at the ground. Then he stepped aside. He moved out of the young man's way and put his open hand out down the length of that street, the way you would hold a door, as if to say, "Go on." And that was worse than anything anybody out there could have done to him. Being blocked would have made Vince Toma somebody. Being let past made him nothing. So he walked. He walked down the middle of Delacroix Street in the light of 81 headlights, past the porches, past the tenants, past the windows he had raised the rent behind, past the dark front of a hardware store a dead man built, and past a 71-year-old widow in a housecoat standing on her own front step with her hands folded in front of her, on the same step where one of his men had set her husband down in the rain 12 hours before. He did not look at her. He couldn't. The crown on his neck went the whole length of that street with him, and it did not mean one single thing to one single person out there. And it never would again. That morning, 3 men in pressed shirts had read Margaret Coyle's whole legal name out loud on her own doorstep, so the entire block could hear it. That night, the entire block came out to watch Vince Toma walk, and not one person out there said his name at all. The police came about 9 minutes after that, called from behind a dozen curtains and from the dark of the diner, and what those 2 cruisers turned onto was the strangest scene either of those officers ever worked. A street packed curb to curb with parked motorcycles, every one of them legal. Better than 100 men standing on the sidewalks with their hands where you could see them, not one of them carrying a thing he should not have been. Nobody drunk, nobody shouting, nobody moving. Licenses and registrations already out and offered before anybody thought to ask for them. Because these were not young men, and every one of them had done this particular dance before. The responding sergeant said afterward that the hardest part of that whole night was the paperwork, because there was not one thing on that street he could write anybody up for. They picked Vince Toma up 2 blocks down, on foot, walking, and he did not give them a bit of trouble. And the only crime scene inside 4 blocks was a wrecked little engine shop, and inside it they found no army, no crew, no war. Just one seated old man at his own workbench, breathing slow, with a split above his ear, and a bag of frozen peas from the break room freezer held to the side of his head. And a 19-year-old boy sitting next to him, not saying anything, and a folded piece of leather back in a gray steel box with the lid closed. And here is the detail that undoes people. And I am not going to rush you past this one either. They kept coming. The thing was finished by 9:20. By 10, there were men arriving who had ridden 3 hours. By 11:30, there were men coming in off the interstate who had ridden 5, who had taken the call at the dinner table and put a coat on and left the plate sitting where it was, and who rolled down to Delacroix Street to find it already over, the police gone, the crew scattered, nothing on earth left for them to do. Not one of them turned around and went home. They parked wherever there was room left to park, and they shut the engine off, and they stood on that sidewalk in the cold with the rest of them. And a good number of them were still standing there when it started getting light. Sometime around midnight, one of them did come inside. One. He did not say anything to the old man either. He set a paper cup of gas station coffee down on the workbench at Rourke's elbow, and he put his hand flat on the back of Rourke's neck for about 2 seconds, the way men in that world do. And then he went back out and stood in the street with the others. Ask yourself why they stayed. There was nothing left to protect by then. They stayed because the point of it was never the fighting. The point was that a woman who believed she had nobody left in the world should be able to get up at 3 in the morning and look out her own window and see, with her own eyes, that she was wrong about that. And she did look. Margaret Coyle sat in her dark kitchen under the photograph of a laughing, dark-haired girl on the back of a motorcycle, and she never once turned the light on. And she watched a street full of men she had never met stand in the cold outside her building, for no reason at all, except that a boy named Sean Coyle had gone off a wet road 40 years ago, and a man had stood on her mother's doorstep with his jacket held in both hands and said a thing about family, and had apparently meant every word of it. She was 71 years old. She had not said her brother's name out loud to another living person in 30 years. At 7 the next morning, the way she had gone out for her paper every morning for 36 years, Margaret Coyle opened her front door. There were still 9 of them on that sidewalk. Somebody had set a folding chair beside her door, up out of the wet. Somebody else had put her gate back on its hinge, the one Walter had been meaning to get to the year he died. The broken flower pot Rourke had swept into a neat pile against the wall the morning before was gone, swept up and carried off. And in its place there was a new one, cheap, from a garden center out on the highway, with nothing planted in it yet. Not one of those men knocked on her door. Not one of them asked her for anything, or told her who they were, or gave her the chance to thank them for it. 2 of them said, "Good morning, ma'am." That was the whole of it. And when she came back up the walk with her paper under her arm, the nearest one stepped out of her way and put 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. And Margaret Coyle stood on her own front step, in the exact spot where a man in a pressed shirt had set her husband's down in the rain 24 hours before, and put her hand over her mouth, and cried where the whole street could see her do it. Nobody on Delacroix Street ever forgot that. Not the fight in the shop, that. The machinery that came after was slow, and it was thorough, and it was, in the end, more complete than any beating Rourke could ever have given anybody. Sal Bruno, who had decided which side of his own life he wanted to stand on, sat down with the detectives, and did not stop talking for 3 days. And the sworn statements came in from the whole block, from the diner owner and the widow, and a dozen people who'd watched from windows. And there was the gun with Vince's prints all over it, and 11 cars on 11 cameras up and down a dying street. And the records of the property company, the rent raised, the phone unanswered. The widow's husband set out in the rain, and it all went together into one long, accumulating case that no crown on any neck could smile its way out of. And one more thing went into it that was not evidence, that no lawyer ever entered into anything, and that mattered more than half of what was. The tenants came, all of them. The building Vince Toma had spent the summer emptying out by fear, emptied itself into a county courthouse hallway instead. 14 households of them. The shift nurse off the second floor, and the 2 brothers on the ground floor, who barely spoke the language, and the young mother out of 4B, who had signed his paper in September because she had been too frightened not to. And they sat on those benches in their good clothes, with their hands in their laps, and waited their turn. And they said out loud, in a room, with him sitting in it, exactly what had been done to them. He had built the entire thing on the certainty that people like that never open their mouths. And he was right about that too. They never had. Not once, not in 3 years, not until the night they stood on their own front steps and watched 100 strangers come in off the highway and hold a street in the cold for a woman not one of those strangers had ever met, and worked out from watching it what standing up actually looks like. The property company came apart inside a month, the way a thing built on fear comes apart the second the fear is gone. And the block reclaimed itself one small piece at a time. The diner back to full days, the rents back down, and the old Coyle hardware store, dark for 3 years, its lights on again by spring, under a young couple who never knew why the neighborhood watched over them so fierce. Vince Toma pleaded to a stack of things and went away for a long time. And the youngest of his crew, the ones who'd run out that door and turned the math around, most of them were never charged with anything worse than being young and afraid in the wrong room, which Rourke, when the detectives asked, said was punishment enough for a person if you let it be. And a year after all of it, a letter came to the shop. No return address. It was from Vince, and it did not ask for a single thing. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't ask Rourke to speak up for him. It didn't try to make itself smaller than it was. It just said that Vince had spent his whole life certain that the man his father should have been was a man who took, and that he understood now, too late, that the man his father should have been was the man in that shop, the one who could take anything he wanted and had decided, on purpose, for 40 years, not to. That was all. Rourke read it once and put it in the steel box, next to the leather, and closed the lid. Margaret Coyle found out, of course. The block tells its stories, and this one it told for years. And eventually somebody told her the old mechanic's first name, Cody. And she went very still. And she walked down the block one morning at 7, when the steel door was going up, and she stood in the doorway of Rourke's small engine under the smell of oil and coffee, and she said, quiet, "I know you. You came to my mother's door. You took your jacket off before you knocked." Rourke didn't say anything for a moment. Then he poured a second cup, black, and set it on the bench for her. And he said, "Your brother was a good writer, Margaret, and a better man. And I made him a promise. And a promise doesn't have an expiration date, just because 40 years go by." She asked him why he never said. And he said, "Because keeping it wasn't ever about you knowing. It was just about me being here at 7. They never talked about that night much afterward, the two of them. But something between them had shifted permanently in a way that never once needed words to be real. And Margaret Coyle lived out her days in the home she and Walter had paid for. And she was never late with anything again. And nobody ever came to her door in the rain. The town mostly let Rourke's past lie. By then, everyone who needed to know already knew exactly who he'd been, and exactly who he'd chosen to become instead. And there is a kind of respect that doesn't go poking at a man's folded-up years. He opened at 7 for another decade. He taught Danny everything, the engines and the other thing too, which was mostly how to stay quiet and how to stand up only when it truly counted. And when Cody Rourke died in his sleep, an old man in a small apartment above a shop he loved, they buried him out of the small brick church on Petrie Street that seats 140. The block came, and then the rest of them came. They came the same way they had come the first time, at the posted speed, headlights on in the middle of a bright morning. And they parked between the lines the whole length of Petrie and around onto Delacroix. And they shut the engines off together. And that silence came down over the neighborhood a second time. And every soul who had been there the first night knew exactly what it was the second it landed. There were more of them this time. Understand what that means. There was no trouble coming. There was nobody to stand between. There was nothing at stake at all, and there were more of them. They filled that little church, and then they filled the steps, and then they filled the sidewalk, and the ones who could not get within 60 feet of the door stood out in the road in the sun with their hats in their hands for 51 minutes, and could not hear a single word of it, and stayed anyway. Margaret Coyle was 81 years old by then, and they walked her up the aisle to the front pew, and a man she had never met in her life sat down beside her and held her hand through the whole of it, because somebody at the back had told somebody at the front who she was. She was the sister. That was all any of them needed to know. 50 years after a young man went off a wet road on a night most of those men had not been born for, his big sister sat in the front pew of a full church, and she was not alone for 1 second of it. Danny runs the shop now. Opens at 7. Every morning, the way you go to church. And on the shelf above the workbench, there's a gray steel box, and inside it there's a folded piece of leather, and Danny has never once taken it out, and he never will, because it doesn't need to come out. It sits there, year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass, not forgotten, just no longer needed. Think back for a second to where this whole thing started. A wet step, an old woman in a housecoat, 3 men in pressed shirts setting a dead husband out in the rain over $240. It looked, in that very first moment, like a mismatch nobody could survive. The strong taking from the weak, the world doing the ugly thing the world too often does when it decides somebody is nothing. But that's the thing about quiet men. The quiet isn't weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice made by somebody who has already been everywhere violence can take a person, and who came back from it on purpose, and set the whole terrible weight of himself down on a shelf, and picked it up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, and then set it down again for good. Vince Toma looked at Cody Rourke and saw an old man who fixed lawnmowers. What he should have seen was a man who had made a promise on a doorstep to a grieving family and who had spent 40 years keeping it, by the simple act of being there at 7 every single morning, just in case. Here's what I keep coming back to, and it isn't the fight. The fight on that shop floor was never the interesting part, and I told you so while it was still going on. And it isn't even the 81, though I would understand completely if that is the piece you carry out of here, because I carry it too. 81 machines on a dying street in the cold and the dark, for a woman not one of those men could have picked out of a room. It's the coffee. 8 years of pouring a second cup, black, for a woman who didn't know he existed, keeping a dead brother's promise in a language nobody around him could even read. Because the 81 only ever came for the one. They came because a man had put a steel door up at 7 o'clock every single morning for 19 years, on the chance that one day somebody would need him to already be there. That is the whole arithmetic of it. A crowd shows up for the man who showed up. So let me ask you something, and I read every single answer to these, I truly do. If you'd been Danny, standing at the mouth of Petrie Street with a clean bus and the whole rest of your life in front of you, and everything in you screaming to keep walking, would you have turned around and gone back through that door? Sit with that one honestly before you answer. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for people who still believe a man's word ought to outlive the man, and that the quiet ones are usually the ones worth watching. If that's you, stick around, subscribe, and stay a while. There are 2 more stories waiting for you right on the screen. One about a diner waitress and a table full of men who thought nobody was coming for her, and one about a funeral procession that shut down 40 miles of highway for a stranger. And thank you, honestly, for caring enough about a widow and an old mechanic to sit with the whole thing all the way to the end. This is a work of fiction. It was inspired by general themes of loyalty and quiet courage, and all persons and events depicted are entirely fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental, and it was created for entertainment.